write children's books. But today, not writing books. I'm at the Appalachian Artisan Center in Heinemann, Kentucky to look at an exhibition of heirloom quilts a la mode. Come on, join me. Let's see what they've got. I'm excited. This is going to be fun. I'm so glad you could join me today because we're going to be looking at heirloom quilts. We're going to be looking at new quilts. We're going to be looking at quilts made by one person, quilts that are made by several people with collective minds and energy and ideas and creativity. Come along, let's go see it. Right this way. Oh, a fun fact. Did you know that the word quilt comes from Latin? It's a derivative meaning stuffed sack. So today we're going to see some beautiful stuffed sacks. The tradition, the knowledge has been passed down from generation to generation, and hopefully with quilt shows like this, we're continuing to pass it on to new generations. So let's get started on our stuffed sack visits. This is a Lone Star quilt pattern, one large star. This quilt is over 100 years old. So not only are they creative and beautiful and wall art, it began its early life with a functional aspect, and that was to keep people warm. There's an eclectic array of quilts in this show. Some have been sleeping in closets for years, decades, and others have just sprung to life recently. We're going to look at all. Come along. This is the largest display room of the quilt show. This small quilt is blue, red, and turquoise. Ann Davis Travis quilted this. Next we have Scrappy Brick Road by Jordan Bogus, and all materials made from Appalachia Quilt and Craft. That is a store in Hazard. Beautiful colors. Next, we have a Rectangle Story. New opportunity for women. This is a group in Berea, Kentucky that worked together to create this beautiful patchwork quilt. And by patchwork, I mean that the quilt is put together in pieces of fabric, and they have usually a repeated pattern and repeated colors. And of course we can see the square patterns and we can see the repeated colors. This is the Tree of Hope by Melissa Henshaw, and she is actually the cultural recovery client for the Appalachian Artisan Center here in Heinemann. Next we have an old quilt. We showed you the Lone Star that was over 100 years old, and this is an old quilt also by Emily Whitaker. And actually Emily owns it. She did not make the quilt. And you can see at the top there's some tatters on it, so it started out as very functional and now has become a decorative piece of art. That again is connecting our past with our present, and it's got a long life to live, so it will also connect us to our future. This is definitely a distinctive quilt, the house that Jane built. This is actually in the shape of a house, and we can see the windows here. If you look closely, you can see a phoenix, the bird, rising from the ashes that is an overlay on top of the quilted pattern. This house existed, a real house existed between 1987 and 2012, the year in which it was burned by arson. Now, the purpose of the phoenix overlay is to represent that from the ashes they survived and thrived. Next, we have quilt pieces that make not a quilt, but a beautiful dress. Bethany Sparkman is the creator of the dress. She also designed it. Bethany was a costume designer at Disney World, and she answered the call for this show by quickly sewing the quilt dress. It will be exhibited at Community Bank in Hyman for the entire month of May, so I hope you can get over and see it, because it's well worth the visit to see this beautiful quilt dress. Quilts that we have looked at so far are patchwork quilts. This quilt is a whole cloth quilt, meaning they used one large piece of cloth for the top. Quilts have three parts: a top, a bottom, and a lining on the inside, which we now use batting, but it used to be called fillers because they used whatever they had on hand. Newspapers were used for a lot, feathers, horsehair, corn shucks. And you wonder, well, if they used newspapers, how did they wash them? They didn't. They took the quilts outside, aired them, and then brought them back in. But the quilts were made with whatever they had on hand. Today, we can make whole cloth quilts because we have access to more fabric. This is a whole cloth quilt. So there are three types: patchwork, whole cloth, and applique. This quilt also happens to be an applique quilt, meaning that there is a fabric and design appliqued on top of the top layer of the pattern. Okay, next we have scrap quilt squares. Teapots is the name of this quilt by Sally Watts. And the pattern is not teapots, but the motif of the fabric is. And many of the old quilts were made from pieces of worn out clothing, grandma's apron, grandpa's shirt, whatever they had available to them. And they could use small bits of fabric and create a beautiful design, as Sally has with this beautiful quilt. A few years ago, the city of Hazard, had magical creatures displayed at doors throughout the town, but they weren't easy to see, so the idea was to go look for them. It was a fun adventure for the family to find them. And Envision Hazard's Magical Creatures door is this quilt. Liz Buchanan made it, and she has pictures of the doors and the magical creature designs featured in each square block of the quilt. This quilt looks like a picture of spring just bursting with flowers, and the beautiful colors, the pinks and the greens, would be ideal for a little girl's bedroom. This little girl would like it in her bedroom. Jane Stumbo loaned the Appalachian Artisan Center a quilt, and she had a special request. This quilt was sewn by her grandmother with handwritten information of church members and their date of membership. She requested the center to embroider the names so that they would not fade. The Artisan Center ran a workshop led by Sarah Kate Morgan from Hyman Settlement School and trained several volunteers to take on this embroidery project. And you can see where they have started embroidering the names, carrying out her wishes and carrying them out beautifully. Originally, quilts served primarily a function to keep people warm and a way to use small bits of fabric that otherwise could not be used. An example is this baby quilt by Geneva Combs from Beattyville, Kentucky, and also Megan Combs. So Geneva and Megan. This one follows along the same way with the beautiful pink dogwood. Has spring written all over it. The blue and white pattern on this quilt has double stitching, which just catches the eye. Another form of quilting is in products that we can use every day other than quilts, and these are satchels and purses. The yellow bag was made by Sylvia Hagens, and the blue bag also by Sylvia Hagens. This quilt was designed to be a wall hanging, and it was made by Kay Willis, and she named it Come Away. This is another quilt by the Opportunity School for women, and you can notice that in patchwork quilts the blocks are held together by sashing. Sashing is a strip of material that holds each block. Of course, we always have people who take a traditional approach to a project and turn it on its head. And that's exactly what happened with this quilt by Artistic Dimensions, New Opportunity School for Women. It is a patchwork quilt. It does have sashing, but look at the sashing that's holding it together. Completely different from the other types of patchwork quilts that we have seen today. It's absolutely gorgeous. This quilt is the Flying Geese Lap Quilt by Gerda Lee Adams. She is truly a master quilter. This is another quilt by Gerda Lee Adams. And yet another. And the Flower Garden quilt is another one by Gerda Lee Adams. And another by Gerda Lee Adams. Going back to the oldest quilt in the show, we can see some of the batting here, and it obviously is filling of some woven fabric. This quilt by Deborah Banger is called Yellow Chanel with Green Border. This quilt is, of course, patchwork. It also has embroidery, stitching, and it has applique. Young and old can create quilts and do a beautiful job. This part of the quilt show is called Young Heirloom Quilts a la Mode. The first one we have is Blake Sloan from Heinemann Elementary, and this is a chain design, and you can see the chain in the pattern of the quilt. The second is by Maddox Howard from Emelina Elementary.
This is Q-Mine.
Who we call Mom.
This is Mom. And this is Q-Mine, her mom, that made this quilt. Q-Mine did.
My name is Susan Boyer, and the quilt in question was made by my great-great-grandmother, passed down to my great-grandmother and passed down to my sister-in-law and my brother.
And my name is Laura Jones, and my husband's great-grandmother, this quilt was hers, and it was passed down to his grandmother and then passed down to him.
And I'm Stephanie Conley, and this is my mom. And this is Lily.
Now, the Lone Star was before any of our time, and about all we know about that is that Cumine's mom, Cumina, made it. It was hers. And then it was passed down. I've helped Larry's grandma make quilts. I helped her make the hexagon quilt and the flower garden quilt and a lot more. In the winter time, she always had a quilt up, and she had this old quilting frame, and it was hung on strings from the ceiling, and so she would let that down every day in the wintertime. She had a quilt, and we would sit around it and quilt and talk, and she taught me a lot of things. Gardening, quilting, and
just keeping a house.
Yeah.
Taught her how to be a woman, I guess.
And when we start using one, we would use it until it couldn't be used anymore.
Until it was more holes.
Yeah. When me and my husband moved in with her, I knew nothing about quilting or gardening or cooking or anything. And we would get up of a morning and go to the garden, and we would work in the garden till time for her soap operas. And then she would want to go home. And then when the shade came over, we'd go back to the garden. So she taught me about gardening and cooking, I watched her cook and
Same quilts she'd get out of the closet and she'd, tell me a story behind them, and that's my connection to the quilts. She made one for one of my boys, and she was so excited because she found a piece of fabric that had their name on it. So, I do remember, I've still got it. It had, his name was Jody, went by Jody, and it had Jody on it. I don't know where she found that, but she was excited because she found his name and put that in the quilt. But she'd have a box full of, and she'd always pull out the quilt pieces, and they'd be in different sizes.
Mm-hmm. And everything she made everything handmade. She didn't use a sewing machine.
She did some, did she?